Imagine a quiet suburban neighborhood, perfect lawns, matching mailboxes, and the kind of silence that almost feels staged. To anyone passing by, it looked like the picture of order and peace. But beneath that polished exterior, fear lingered like smoke. The HOA here wasn't just strict, they ruled like tyrants. They fined families for Christmas lights, wrote up tickets for a car tire touching the wrong patch of asphalt, and even dictated curtain colors. And tonight, they were about to take things much further. It was close to midnight when headlights cut across one particular driveway. Inside the house, a family was winding down. A mother tucked her child into bed while her husband, calm on the outside but alert on the inside, watched TV with one eye and the window with the other. Then came the sound of boots on gravel, the jingle of belts, and a fist pounding on the door. A loud voice boomed, "Open up! This is the police! You're under arrest!" The wife froze, clutching her child tighter. The man stood slowly, but he didn't panic. Because this was no ordinary homeowner. This was the chief of police himself. And something about the so-called officers outside immediately struck him as wrong. The patches on their uniforms didn't match. Their radios didn't transmit properly. Their posture wasn't that of real officers. They were impostors. But he didn't call them out just yet. He signaled his wife to take their child upstairs and stepped toward the door with deliberate calm. When he opened it, the impostors puffed out their chests, speaking with fake authority. "Sir, you are in violation of HOA orders. You've ignored repeated fines and warnings. By the order of the Homeowners Association, you are under arrest." The words were almost laughable. Arrested by the HOA? Still, the chief didn't laugh. He let the silence hang until one of the men grew bolder, pulling out handcuffs and reaching for his arm. In a blur of motion, the chief seized the man's wrist, twisted it effortlessly, and sent him crumpling to the ground with a cry. The second imposter froze, hand hovering near his fake holster, but the chief's eyes cut through him like steel. "Don't even think about it." Then he revealed himself. Calm but commanding, he said, "I am the chief of police, and you just committed felony impersonation of an officer and attempted false arrest. You're not leaving this street as free men tonight," the impostors stammered, their arrogance draining away like water from a cracked bucket. They blurted out excuses, claiming they were just following orders, that the HOA had told them to do this. But it was too late. The chief's phone was already in his hand. Within minutes, real squad cars rolled into the neighborhood, their red and blue lights painting the night. The impostors were cuffed, this time by actual police. Neighbors peeked through their blinds, whispering in shock. "What happened?" one murmured. "The HOA sent fake cops to arrest someone," another gasped. Then came the final revelation that spread like wildfire. The target had been the chief of police himself. As the neighborhood buzzed, the chief stood quietly in his doorway, calm but burning inside. His wife looked at him, a mixture of relief and anger in her eyes. Relief that he was safe. Anger that their family had been targeted this way. He placed a reassuring hand on her shoulder and said, "It's handled. They crossed a line they can't crawl back from." But he knew this was far from over. This wasn't just about two fake cops. This was about a homeowners association that believed it was untouchable. What they didn't know was that they had just started a war with the one man who knew the law better than anyone else, and who wasn't afraid to use it. The next morning, word of the incident had already spread. His officers smirked quietly as he walked into his department, trading jokes about an HOA bold enough to send imposters to the chief's house. But behind the humor was respect. They knew he had stared intimidation in the face and handled it without breaking a sweat. Later, as he filed charges for impersonation, unlawful arrest, and conspiracy, the imposters broke like glass under questioning. They confessed almost immediately, naming the HOA president as the mastermind. The chief wasn't surprised. He'd met the man before, a smug figure in his late 50s dressed like a corporate CEO at neighborhood meetings, loving every ounce of control he could wield. The next HOA meeting was just days away. The chief knew the board would try to spin the story, painting the incident as a misunderstanding, downplaying their role. But he was ready. This wasn't just about him anymore. It was about every family in the neighborhood who had been fined, harassed, and bullied into silence. That Friday, the community hall filled to the brim. Residents shuffled nervously in folding chairs while the board sat up front like self-proclaimed royalty. The president tapped the microphone, clearing his throat. Neighbors, as you know, there was an unfortunate misunderstanding this week involving some contractors and one of our residents. The chief almost laughed out loud. Contractors? Fake uniforms, fake badges, and threats of arrest weren't contractors. They were criminals. And tonight the truth was about to come crashing down like a storm. The community hall was overflowing that Friday night. Folding chairs were packed into neat rows, but the people sitting in them were anything but calm. Their whispers filled the air like buzzing bees, rising and falling in waves of nervous energy. Some neighbors clutched crumpled letters and violation notices, their hands shaking with a mixture of anger and fear. Others simply stared forward, weary from years of intimidation. At the front, the HOA board sat stiffly behind a long table, their faces polished into smug masks of authority. The president, a man in his late 50s with slicked-back gray hair and a suit too expensive for a neighborhood meeting, tapped the microphone. His voice was smooth, practiced, almost oily. "Neighbors," he began, "thank you for attending tonight's important meeting. I'd like to address the incident that took place earlier this week." He cleared his throat, adjusting his tie as if that would keep his composure intact. The men involved were contractors hired to perform a late-night inspection. Unfortunately, their presence was misinterpreted. The words floated in the air, absurd and hollow. A murmur spread through the crowd. Contractors? At midnight? In fake police uniforms? The excuse was so thin it was insulting. People shifted in their seats, exchanging skeptical looks. And then slowly, one man raised his hand. The room hushed instantly, because this wasn't just any man. It was the chief of police, sitting calmly in the second row. The president's smile faltered. His voice wavered ever so slightly as he asked, "Yes, Chief? Do you have something to add?" The chief rose from his chair, his presence commanding silence without effort. He didn't shout. He didn't need to. His voice was low, steady, carrying the weight of truth. Those men were not contractors. They were criminals. They wore fake uniforms, carried fake radios, and announced themselves as police officers. That is felony impersonation of law enforcement, punishable by years in prison. And they confessed on record that they were sent by this board. By you. The words hit the room like thunder. Gasps erupted, followed by a storm of whispers. Neighbors leaned toward one another, wide-eyed, as if they couldn't believe what they'd just heard. The president's face turned crimson, his mask of control slipping. "Let's not jump to conclusions," he sputtered. "There must be some misunderstanding." But the crowd wasn't buying it anymore. A woman in the back stood abruptly, her hand shaking but her voice sharp. "My son was fined $300 because his car was parked outside the driveway for 10 minutes. Another man rose to his feet, his voice trembling with pent-up rage. "My wife was harassed for leaving holiday decorations up one day too long." Voices began to rise all at once, a wave of frustration years in the making. Some shouted about ridiculous fines for lawn heights, others about threats of foreclosure. The room became a storm of anger, accusations flying at the board like arrows. For the first time in years, the people were no longer silent. The board members shifted uncomfortably, their smug confidence cracking under the pressure. The president pounded the gavel furiously. "Order! Order in this meeting!" he barked, but his voice was drowned out by the roar of his own neighbors turning against him. The board, once feared, now looked small, cornered animals scrambling to regain control. Then the chief lifted one hand and the noise died instantly. The silence was thick, electric, as all eyes turned back to him. He scanned the room slowly, deliberately, letting the weight of his presence sink in. When he spoke again, his voice was like steel. "You've all been afraid for too long," he said. "But fear only works if you bow to it. This board has convinced you they are above the law. They are not. What they tried at my house was possible only because they thought no one here would ever challenge them. Well, I'm challenging them, and so should you. The hall erupted in applause. It wasn't polite clapping. It was a release, raw and thunderous. Neighbors who had once avoided eye contact now cheered together. Not everyone clapped, but enough did to shake the walls and wipe the smirk off the president's face. In that moment, the HOA's grip cracked wide open. Residents left the meeting buzzing with plans. Some whispered about petitions, others about lawsuits. Some spoke of voting the board out entirely. For the first time, the people were united not by fear, but by hope. The board, meanwhile, whispered among themselves, their faces pale. They had relied on silence and intimidation to maintain power. But now, silence was broken, and the cracks in their empire were spreading fast. The retaliation began the very next day. Letters began appearing in mailboxes, typed in cold official language. They warned residents not to support the chief, not to participate in meetings outside of official HOA gatherings, and not to spread false claims. Some letters carried darker threats, foreclosure proceedings, fines that could drain a savings account, even whispers of legal action. But instead of silencing the residents, the letters backfired. Families who once lived in fear now grew angrier. They gathered in each other's living rooms, whispering plans late into the night. They swapped stories of abuse, compared notices, and passed around copies of the chief's police report. The community, once fragmented and afraid, was slowly becoming something stronger, a united front. The board grew desperate. One night, 2 board members crept up to the chief's mailbox with spray paint in hand. They planned to vandalize his property to send a message. But before the first hiss of paint could leave the can, the chief's voice boomed from the shadows of his porch. "What do you think you're doing?" The men jumped, dropping the can in shock. The porch light snapped on, illuminating the chief's sharp gaze. He stepped forward, his voice low and cutting. "Do you really think you can intimidate me? Do you think I don't see every move you make?" The men froze for a moment, like deer in headlights, before bolting into the night, their footsteps echoing down the empty street. But the harassment didn't stop. Private security SUVs began cruising the neighborhood, their tinted windows reflecting porch lights like watchful eyes. They wrote down license plate numbers, parked for hours on quiet corners, and rolled slowly past homes at night. The residents whispered that it felt like living under occupation, like their own neighborhood had become a prison. The chief reassured them. "Don't run," he told them firmly. "That's exactly what they want. Bullies win when you back down. Stand your ground." Slowly, the residents began to believe him. They began to resist. An elderly widow came forward, her voice shaking as she confessed that the HOA had threatened to foreclose on her house over unpaid fines. She had been too afraid to fight back, too alone. The chief placed a steady hand over hers and promised, "You won't be alone anymore. Not this time." Word spread quickly. More residents came forward with their stories: threats, harassment, fines that made no sense, and intimidation that had lasted years. The chief gathered every document, every testimony, every scrap of evidence. His file grew thicker by the day, a mountain of proof waiting to crush the board, yet the HOA refused to surrender. One evening, the chief returned home to find red spray paint dripping across his garage in bold, jagged letters. "Get out." His wife gasped. Their child clung to her leg, eyes wide with fear. The chief clenched his jaw, but kept his voice calm. "It means they know they're losing," he said. The next HOA meeting was chaos before it even began. Residents filled the room with fire in their eyes, waving violation notices like weapons. The president tried to assert control, pounding the gavel and shouting over the noise, but his words were swallowed by outrage. Neighbors shouted accusations, demanded answers, and cried out for change. And then the chief stood once more. He raised a folder high above his head, filled with reports, statements, and confessions. His voice rang out steady and undeniable. "These are police reports. These are witness statements. These are signed confessions. This is the truth. And soon, a court will decide your fate." The silence that followed was heavier than any gavel. The board sat pale and frozen, stripped of their false power. The neighbors, once too afraid to speak, now rose together in anger and unity. The tide had turned completely, but deep down the chief knew this was just the beginning. The HOA was desperate, cornered, and dangerous. And desperate enemies always make their boldest, darkest moves when they realize they're losing. The first threat came as a text message from an unknown number. "Back off or next time it won't be paint." The chief didn't reply. Within hours, he traced the burner phone to a shell company tied directly to the HOA's legal fund. Their arrogance was breathtaking. They really thought intimidation would silence him. Days later, an abandoned van was discovered near the neighborhood. Inside were hundreds of surveillance photos. Families at work, kids playing in yards, his own wife and child captured in candid moments, taped on the walls like trophies. The discovery rattled the community, but instead of cowering, the residents grew angry. They formed patrols, carried radios and flashlights, and began watching out for one another. The HOA's attempts at fear were only uniting the people further. The chief dug deeper and uncovered the truth. Behind the HOA board was a network of real estate firms. They funneled money through HOAs, harassed families, forced foreclosures, and flipped houses for profit. The smug HOA president wasn't a mastermind. He was a pawn in a much bigger game, one tied to organized crime. One evening, his wife asked softly, "How far are they willing to go?" He looked up from his files, his eyes calm but hard. "As far as I let them, but I won't let them go further." Her fears were justified. One night, an SUV blocked his car on a deserted road. 4 men stepped out, heavy-set and cold-eyed. One sneered, "Walk away, Chief, or we'll bury you." The chief stepped from his car, calm and unshaken. "You think you scare me? You've never faced a man with nothing to lose." Before the men could react, headlights swept across the road. Unmarked cars arrived, agents pouring out. The thugs scrambled, but it was too late. They were cuffed and hauled away. Another piece of the network, torn out. Raids followed soon after. At dawn, officers and federal agents swept into the HOA office and the homes of board members. The president, once so smug, was dragged out in handcuffs, his face drained of all confidence. Across the state, records and contracts were seized, exposing fraud and money laundering. Neighbors stood on their porches, watching the empire of fear collapse before their eyes. But the chief knew this wasn't just about one neighborhood. The paper trail led to bigger players, shadowy investors running the same scheme in communities across multiple states. What started with lawn fines and violation notices was part of a machine powered by greed and crime. The danger grew sharper. Late one night, another message appeared on his phone. "Stop digging, or your family pays." He showed it to his wife. Her face went pale, but her eyes hardened. "Then let them come," she whispered. "We're not bending anymore." Her strength fueled his own. He met quietly with trusted officers, not as their chief but as a man who needed allies. He laid out the threats, the money trails, the intimidation. They pledged their support without hesitation. He wasn't alone in this war. Meanwhile, the neighborhood itself transformed. Families once divided by fear now stood together. They formed watches, checked on each other, and refused to bow to intimidation. When the HOA issued a wave of bogus violations against outspoken families, the residents didn't fold. They gathered on the chief's lawn, waving the notices like flags. "This is the last straw," one woman shouted. "We're done being bullied. We stand with you, Chief." The crowd erupted in cheers. For the first time, the board wasn't feared. It was despised, powerless against the united voices of the people. The chief looked over the crowd and raised his voice. "They wanted us afraid. They wanted us divided. But all they've done is remind us that together we are unstoppable. We won't run. We won't hide. We'll fight this the right way, with truth, with law, and with unity. And they will fall." The cheers thundered through the neighborhood, echoing down the street. The HOA had started this war with intimidation and greed. But now, the people were awake. And as the chief stood with his community behind him, one truth became undeniable. This fight would end not with fear but with justice.